remember the first night I slept in that cramped bedroom. Even before I closed my eyes, the air felt strangely thick, like a cold hand pressing against my lungs. The old floorboards in the hallway outside groaned every time I shifted my weight, and the feeble glow of the street lamp cast an anemic light through the thin curtains. Something about this house felt wrong, like a constant electric pulse under my skin, prickling with a sensation of warning. I told myself it was just the anxiety of moving into a new place on a tight budget. I tried to ignore the sinking feeling that I was not supposed to be there at all. Classes had just started, and the affordability of a semi-detached house near campus was irresistible. The landlord had assured me that my neighbor was a quiet, solitary person who mostly kept to himself. At first, that sounded like a blessing. My coursework was intense, and I needed as much peace and quiet as I could get. But on the second night, I woke up to a sound that froze my lungs mid-breath. It was a muffled sobbing, like someone crying just behind the wall to my right. I checked my clock, 2:13 a.m. My heart pounded so hard that my stomach churned. I strained to hear more, but only silence followed. I eventually convinced myself I had imagined it. Yet the next night, around the same time, the sobbing returned, faint but unmistakable. The hair on my arms lifted as I lay there, my chest tightening with fear. I told myself that maybe my neighbor was having a late-night breakdown or rewatching some sad movie at a low volume. It seemed harmless enough, but the sound didn't fade. It lingered, weaving through the thin walls until it pressed into my ears. Then it morphed into a strange lullaby, soft, off-key singing that made my breath hitch in my throat. I went next door the following afternoon, tapping tentatively on the neighbor's door. When he answered, I noticed how pale his face was and how his eyes had a dull, almost lifeless quality. I mentioned the late-night noises and apologized if he was going through something difficult. He insisted, in a polite but firm tone, that he lived alone and made no noise. He seemed surprised to hear about my complaints, adding flatly that he had no idea what I was talking about. As he spoke, I sensed a shiver crawl across my back, as though a cold presence stood behind me, just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching from the upstairs window, a shifting shadow that disappeared the moment I glanced up. That night, I sat in my dimly lit bedroom, chewing the inside of my cheek, waiting to see if the sounds would start again. My heart thudded like a drum when the quiet crying began at exactly 2 a.m. This time, it wasn't just whimpering. It was a guttural moan, so close it felt like it was coming from inside the walls. I turned on the overhead light, my breath shallow, and stared at the paint where the wall met my headboard. My eyes widened in disbelief. Dark droplets, like beads of sweat, oozed from the plaster. They glistened in the light, creeping downward in slow rivulets. My hand trembled so violently that I could barely keep my flashlight steady as I tried to examine the fluid. The room smelled faintly metallic. My mouth went dry, and I swallowed against the sensation of panic ripping through my chest. I scrubbed the wall clean the next morning, refusing to let myself believe it was anything other than a bizarre leak. My landlord was dismissive when I called to report it, suggesting condensation or old pipes. He promised to send a handyman the next week, but no one showed up. Meanwhile, I avoided my neighbor, uncertain if confronting him again would make any difference. Every time I passed his door or saw his window, a surge of dread knotted my stomach. I felt that same intangible presence, like eyes boring into the back of my head. By the 5th night, I could no longer sleep. My entire body was on edge, anticipating the moment that crying would start. I was drenched in sweat, the sheets tangled around my legs. When the sobs echoed through the wall again, I bolted upright. My heart hammered so intensely that I could feel each pulse throb in my temples. This time I fought the urge to hide. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, hoping for some clue that I could rationalize. All I got was that same lullaby, faint and warbling, as though drifting in from a distant corridor. In the ensuing days, I tried to focus on my coursework, but my concentration was shot. During lectures, my eyelids felt heavy, and I kept replaying those eerie noises in my mind. I began to suspect I was hallucinating from sleep deprivation. I grew paranoid, jumping at the slightest sound, snapping my head around whenever I felt a hint of movement in my peripheral vision. My appetite vanished, replaced by a constant queasiness. The musty smell of the house started to cling to my clothes, and no matter how often I aired the room, the odor lingered like a warning. At one point, I mustered the courage to confront my neighbor more assertively. I knocked on his door several times. When he finally opened it, his eyes looked even more sunken, and his hands trembled slightly. I mentioned the noises again, my voice cracking under the weight of my unease. He repeated that he lived alone and didn't know what I was talking about. He swore he heard nothing at night. Then he closed the door with an abrupt finality that sent a ripple of dread through my chest. As I walked away, I sensed movement behind the upstairs curtains. A shape flickered in the window, darker than the dim interior behind it. It felt like a silent threat, a presence that was neither fully alive nor completely absent. Desperation took over. I set up a small camera on my desk, hoping to capture the wall at night. The next morning, I played back hours of footage. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but what I saw made my stomach lurch. There was a moment, around 2:07 a.m., when the wall seemed to shimmer, as though sweating again. But in the dim glow of my desk lamp, the droplets looked like they were being pushed out by something inside, something that pulsed like a heartbeat. Then, for a split second, there was a human silhouette near my bed, but the image glitched, and it vanished. I couldn't stay there another night. My nerves were beyond frayed, and I was certain I was losing my mind. I spent the day packing my few belongings, each movement twitchy and urgent. The landlord wouldn't refund my deposit, but I didn't care. By dusk, I was ready to leave. Yet, as I loaded the final box into my car, I glanced up at the neighbor's upstairs window one last time. The same dark figure stood there, motionless, staring down at me. My breath caught, and an icy dread coiled in my stomach. For a long moment, I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure shifted slightly, as if pressing closer to the glass. My heart thudded so violently that my vision wavered. Then, with deliberate slowness, it reached out and touched the window from the inside, leaving a faint smear of darkness on the pane. I felt a surge of nausea and fear so profound that my knees nearly gave out. I knew I had to go, immediately. I drove away, sweat chilling on my skin, my mind racing through every bizarre moment. Even hours later, when I pulled into a friend's driveway, the heaviness in my chest refused to lift. I couldn't unsee those dark droplets on the wall, couldn't unhear the lullaby that seemed to echo in my skull. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that shadow in the window, watching me, as though it was already marking me from the other side of the wall. Some nights, in the silence of my new room, I still imagine I hear faint sobs creeping through the plaster, and every time I do, my pulse spikes, and I wonder if I ever truly escaped. I remember that morning with unsettling clarity. The sky was an uncanny shade of gray, as though the sun refused to fully rise. A heavy hush clung to the air, and even the birds seemed reluctant to sing. My heart was drumming against my ribs before we'd even set off, but I brushed it aside as pre-hike jitters. In hindsight, I wish I had turned back right then. There was a thickness to the atmosphere that I couldn't name, a sense of latent threat hovering just beyond my understanding. My two friends, Gabriel and Marcus, had convinced me that we needed an epic summer adventure, so we chose a famous mountain trail known for breathtaking waterfalls. They were eager to see the cascades that form there every June when the snow melt rushes down the rocks. I still recall how the distant thunder seemed to echo my own misgivings as we unloaded our gear from the trunk of Marcus's old SUV. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, but no one wanted to abort the plan. I kept telling myself this was just normal mountain weather, unpredictable and fleeting. If I had known what lay ahead, I would have run. We set off early, boots crunching on the dirt and gravel of the main path. Initially, everything felt almost serene. The first waterfall was indeed spectacular, a curtain of white mist roaring into a rocky pool. I remember my pulse surging with excitement for a moment. We even took photos, letting the spray cool our faces. Then, in what seemed like seconds, the atmosphere changed. A stiff wind picked up, carrying an eerie whistle through the trees. The temperature dropped, and the distant thunder grew louder. Without warning, fog drifted in, swallowing the lush greenery around us. We tried to follow the faint outline of the trail, but the fog was too dense. Our flashlights only revealed swirling shapes of gray and white, and the forest felt strangely silent. Even our breathing sounded amplified, echoing back at us as if the mist itself were listening. Gabriel mentioned that the map indicated a shortcut just beyond the ridge, so we pressed forward, determined not to let the weather ruin our day. That was when we stumbled upon an ancient wooden sign, barely legible. Danger, do not proceed. The letters were faded, but the warning was unmistakable. My hands trembled as I traced the peeling paint. An irrational pulse of fear seized my chest. Marcus muttered that it was probably an old sign meant for winter conditions, maybe avalanche warnings. Yet I sensed something deeper in those weathered words, almost as if the sign itself were urging us to turn around. Just as we stood there, uncertain, I heard a faint voice through the fog. It was female, calling our names in a melodic whisper that raised every hair on my arms. We hadn't seen a single person all day, so how could anyone know who we were? I looked at Gabriel and Marcus, who seemed just as puzzled. No one acknowledged the voice directly, as if speaking about it would confirm it was real. We pushed on, half convinced that the voice was a trick of the wind or a product of our fraying nerves. The path became muddier, each step producing a grotesque sucking sound. The trees were looming silhouettes, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal arms. My heart thudded louder every time I heard the crunch of leaves behind me, only to spin around and find nothing there. A few times, Gabriel swore he saw flickers of movement just past the tree line. Marcus kept insisting we should hurry back, but we couldn't find the original trail. Every turn seemed to lead us deeper into the haze. That's when the voice returned, closer now. It called my name in the same lilting tone, as if beckoning me into the swirl of mist. My stomach churned. I felt beads of sweat trickling down my temples despite the cold air. I had the jarring sensation that someone was standing right behind me, breathing softly against my neck, but whenever I spun around, I only saw swirling fog and the pale outlines of twisted trunks. My mouth felt dry, and my hands shook with a mounting dread. The forest itself seemed alive, straining to hide something just out of sight. All at once, we stumbled onto a narrow path that seemed to curve back toward the base of the mountain. Relief washed over us for a brief moment, and our footsteps quickened, ignoring the exhaustion that cramped our calves. The fog thinned slightly, revealing glimpses of moss-covered stones and thick roots coiling across the ground. A trickle of light filtered through the canopy, and I thought we might have finally escaped that oppressive labyrinth. My breathing steadied, and I could feel my heart rate slow, if only by a fraction. Gabriel mentioned that he recognized a set of boulders near the main exit. We picked up our pace, almost daring to hope. Then Marcus pointed down, his voice quivering. There, in the soft mud behind us, lay a series of footprints. They were wet, as though the person had just trudged through a stream. Their size matched our own boots, but they were inverted. Backward impressions, heel where the toes should be, leading directly after us. My pulse hammered again, the echo of fear almost drowning out my rational mind. It was as if something had been following our every step, mirroring our path in reverse. Each print glistened with water, droplets sliding into the soil. My gut twisted with alarm. The voice from the fog suddenly felt closer than ever. I stared at Gabriel and Marcus, who looked as terrified as I felt. There was a moment when none of us spoke. My vision blurred slightly, and my legs threatened to buckle. For an instant, I questioned whether those footprints could have been ours somehow, distorted by panic and confusion. But the shape was too deliberate, too wrong. Adrenaline surged, and I felt my chest tighten. It was like the forest itself was mocking our attempt to leave. We broke into a half-run, no longer caring about caution or stealth. Our only goal was to reach the parking area, no matter what lurked in the trees. The footprints kept appearing, as if they were materializing the moment we looked away. My throat constricted with every gulp of air, and I could taste the tang of desperation in my mouth. Each time I glanced back, I almost expected to see a figure with its head turned unnaturally around, but the fog concealed everything beyond a few meters. By some miracle, we burst out of the forest near a gravel path that led to the ranger station. The sky was still heavily overcast, but the suffocating mist stayed behind the tree line as if bound to that haunted place. My clothes were drenched in sweat, my mind teetering on the edge of disbelief. Neither Gabriel nor Marcus said a word about what we'd experienced, yet their eyes told me they felt the same choking dread. Even in the open air, I sensed that presence clinging to us, unseen and unshakable. That night, I lay awake, replaying the voice in my head, its eerie echo refusing to fade. Sometimes I still feel an inexplicable chill in my bones, as though the fog lingers around me even under a bright sun. I can't erase the image of those backward footprints trailing us, each step a silent challenge to our sanity. We made it off that mountain, but a part of me never really left. Something was out there, calling, waiting, an impossible, inverted reflection of ourselves that I doubt we've truly escaped. And every time I close my eyes, I wonder if it's still following me, step by backward step, hidden just beyond the final curtain of mist. The night clung to my skin the instant I stepped out of the car. In the distance, the cabin sat by the lake, every window blazing like a beacon that shouldn't exist out here in the emptiness. My heart thumped in my ears, and my palms felt slick with sweat, though the air was cold enough to sting. The darkness surrounding us almost seemed alive, like a silent audience waiting for us to make a fatal mistake. I remember receiving that strange flyer for a secret party. It was shoved under our apartment door, the edges charred at the corners as if exposed to a flame. The text promised a night of music and celebration at a secluded cabin. No hosts needed because the place itself is the invitation. A few of my friends agreed it sounded ridiculous, but something about it piqued our curiosity. We were bored, restless, so we piled into 2 cars and drove until pavement turned to gravel, until the glow of city lights died behind us. When we arrived, it was unsettling how the cabin glowed with life yet felt utterly abandoned. Music drifted out into the night, some crackling tune that belonged on a decades-old vinyl. Empty red cups and half-finished bottles littered the porch, suggesting a party that either ended abruptly or never truly began. I stepped inside first, scanning for any sign of an actual host. There was a stale odor beneath the surface of beer and perfume, something acrid that reminded me of burned paper. My chest tightened with each shallow breath, and I could feel the hair on my arms prickling with an intangible anxiety. The place was oddly welcoming at first glance, filled with mismatched furniture and dim, colorful lights draped from the rafters. My friends and I tried to settle in, telling each other we should make the most of it. One of them murmured that perhaps the host was simply late. Another joked about how we might be on a hidden camera show. In my gut, though, I sensed that we were not alone, even though we saw no one. Something about the flicker of those lights and the persistent hum of the old music made my stomach churn with unease. As I wandered through the main room, I noticed an old photo album resting on a table. Dust coated its leather cover, and my fingertips tingled when I touched it. Flipping the pages, I found black and white snapshots of people dancing and laughing, dressed in vintage clothing that placed them at least half a century ago. They held drinks and wore wide smiles, but every single face was smeared or distorted in the photo. Those smiles looked more like twitching grimaces, and the eyes, barely visible, seemed replaced by faint dark smudges. My breathing grew ragged, and I snapped the album shut. When I tried to steady myself by gripping the edge of the table, I noticed my hand was trembling. Not long after, we began to truly feel how wrong everything was. Someone pointed out that the odor of burning had intensified. The music, once an inconspicuous background noise, took on a sharper, more discordant tone, as if the record were warped. Some claimed to hear faint laughter, even footsteps overhead, though we found no second floor when we explored the cabin. My heart pounded so forcefully it almost hurt, and I had to pause to catch my breath, tasting metal in the back of my throat. Outside, the lake appeared motionless, reflecting the cabin's glow in a way that made the structure look like it was on fire. The reflection felt more real than the cabin itself, like a gateway to something horrifying beneath the calm surface of the water. My chest tightened again, and a cold sweat trickled down my spine. I kept imagining a shadow or shape drifting under the glassy lake, waiting to surface. But every time I blinked, it was gone, replaced by ripples that shouldn't have been there. Inside, one friend said in a hushed tone that they found more photographs tacked to a wall near the back. In each of them, the same contorted faces appeared, blurred and uncanny, their expressions so warped they looked more like screams, frozen into something akin to a grin. A creeping panic set in, and I could feel my knees weakening. My breath came in tight bursts, and an electric buzz of dread settled at the base of my skull, making me question every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. Then, without warning, the music stopped. The lights flickered, and the hush that followed felt impossibly loud. My ears rang in the sudden silence. My mouth went dry, and I realized my fingertips had started to go numb. A single lamp, perched on a cluttered counter, began swaying back and forth as though nudged by an invisible hand. The scratchy tension in my lungs refused to let me breathe deeply. I was dizzy, certain I was on the verge of passing out. And then a curtain near the back window burst into flames. There was no spark, no candle, no logical source. It simply ignited, and the fire danced with a vicious glee. Smoke attacked my throat, forcing me to cough uncontrollably. My eyes burned, tears streaming down my cheeks. I staggered backward, yelling that we had to get out. My friends, equally terrified, rushed to the exit. I caught a glimpse of flickering light on the old photo album, the flame reflecting off the plastic cover as if daring me to stay. But survival instinct kicked in. Nothing else mattered but escaping that suffocating heat and the suffocating panic in my gut. We sprinted outside, stumbling over the uneven porch steps in our desperation. My heart hammered so ferociously I thought it might burst. I can still recall the sound of that curtain crackling and the acrid stench of burning fabric blending with the cool night air. We left everything behind: bones, jackets, drinks half consumed, scattering into the darkness as if the cabin might consume us next. The air felt heavier than before, pressing on my shoulders like an unseen presence urging me to keep running. Even back in the car, with the engine roaring and gravel spinning under the tires, I couldn't shake the suffocating sensation in my chest. None of us spoke at first. We were too rattled, too convinced we'd glimpsed something we could never logically explain. My body shook with a tremor I couldn't control, sweat turning cold on my skin. I realized in that moment that the fear had lodged itself deep within me, nestling into my mind where reason and calm once resided. Every so often I wake in the middle of the night, certain I smell that faint trace of smoke. I see those contorted faces in the corners of my room when the lights are off. I tell myself it's just the memory playing tricks, but I can't rid myself of the feeling that the cabin is still out there, bright lights blazing, waiting for unsuspecting wanderers to heed an invitation that should have remained hidden. Sometimes in dreams, I'm back at that lake, the cabin's reflection on the water twisting until it looks like a gateway to somewhere unspeakable. I never forget the way my heart thundered that night, the way my lungs seized up in absolute terror. And even though I escaped, I can't help but suspect that a part of me never truly left that burning curtain, forever trapped with those distorted faces in the silent glow of that impossible party.